Hello everyone. So today we're going to be looking at some of the review from the government course, specifically looking at the first three foundational documents. So as I stated last week in some of the reviews, we're going to be focusing specifically on government this week because the test is coming up. Therefore, it is better for us to use this time to focus on materials that we covered previously instead of moving forward with micro content. So specifically today in this lesson, we're going to be looking at the first three foundational documents that most people would make the argument it's essentially the foundation of our nation, that it was through the collective effort of all three of these documents, as well as the signs of the time that essentially led to this necessity. So essentially, we're going to be looking at the Declaration of Independence, which was arguably probably the greatest divorce letter, greatest breakup letter of all time, as we were one of the first nations ever to successfully break away from a major power, with us breaking away from Great Britain and laying the foundation for other nations to follow in the same footsteps, such as one of the second most famous revolutions was actually by a group of enslaved people in Haiti in 1803. So different time, different subject, but it's just it's good information to know, essentially this idea that a small group of colonies, such as the American colonies, were able to go up against and successfully defeat the largest power at the time. I use the term sometimes hegemon. Hegemon's a term used in international relations, more specifically with the hegemonic stability theory. It's a little bit out of the scope of this course, but it's good information to know, this idea of a leading global power and how there's rise and falls that occur within all of this. So it's just good information to know. So specifically looking at the Declaration of Independence, which was the greatest breakup letter of all time, we have the Articles of Confederation, which essentially was the first constitution of these new set nation state. And there's a lot of issues with it. And it's allowed for an evolution within that document to eventually lead to it being completely just left by the wayside. And the drafting of a new formal document, a new formal organization of government, which we now know as United States Constitution, and it is a living, breathing document that we use today that's only been changed 27 times. So definitely for its time, it was a very, very revolutionized document. So specifically, we're going to be looking at kind of the context of the Declaration of Independence. So we have the 13 colonies who were essentially indebted to Great Britain. There's a lot of different issues they're running into. There was a lot of different acts that were passed. Essentially, these were things that excluded the colonists from doing business with other nations. Capitalism did not exist in this situation. Essentially, either you bought it from Britain or you didn't buy it at all. Such as with tea, you had the Tea Act, which essentially placed super, super high taxes on tea. Most famously from that, we stemmed and had the Boston Tea Party, whereas a group of the Sons of Liberty took and dressed up as Native Americans, hijacked a tea in the middle of Boston Harbor, and proceeded to dump these barrels of tea over the side into the harbor as a sign of protest to the Tea Act. You had the Stamp Act, essentially was a tax that was placed on any formal document, any legal document that needed to be signed and drafted and registered with the state, and carried with it a extremely high tax. So this was met with a lot of negativity at the time period. Looking at it from the 2020 lens, it's not as crazy, seeing that we pay a lot of tax on a lot of documents that we have. Essentially, you pay tax on your driver's license, you pay tax on your birth certificates, you pay tax on your marriage licenses, so business licenses. So this idea of filing contracts and filing any type of government documents, so documentations or registrations, and having to pay a particular tax on it isn't as crazy now, but in the 1700s, that was just seen as being barbaric, this idea of this. Another big issue was in relation to representation. Most famously, there was a statement made by Patrick Henry was, "Give me liberty or give me death." This idea that you say that we're represented, you say that we're members of the colony, members of Great Britain, the colonies and Great Britain are one unified entity. However, we're not being treated the same way. You treat the colonists in America totally different than you treat those who natively still live in Great Britain. So there's a lot of issues going on. We talked about it again. There was some other attempts made by the colonists to try to not have to go to this point, not have to dissect and just disseminate any type of relationship with Great Britain. Most famously, we looked at the Olive Branch Petition. That was the last ditch effort made by the colonists to try to reach out to the king, essentially saying that maybe it's Parliament causing all these issues, maybe Parliament's not referring this information to the king and we're taking, and maybe there's a disconnect going on. And once the king sees this disconnect happening, that he may take and step in and fix any of these issues. Unfortunately, the king was actually at hand of what was happening. The king knew exactly what was happening. The king, in most cases, was ordering these certain events to occur, and he didn't even read the Olive Branch Petition. So not necessarily just reading and not replying, he wouldn't even read it. This was seen as the biggest slap in the face to the colonists. So this led to a drafting of a document that would soon become known as the Declaration of Independence. Whereas it was primarily drafted by Thomas Jefferson. He was given the orders to focus on the majority of the organization and the initial drafting of the document. There was some insight given in by John Adams as well as Benjamin Franklin. They also contributed some different information to it, and it was authorized by the Second Continental Congress of the colonies. So essentially what the big idea was that they were trying to focus on with the drafting of this document was a balance between governmental power and individual rights. And this idea that there needed to be an established line of reasoning that everyone could understand, that was universal across all sectors of the colonies. So what did this document do? First off, the document declared the colonies as being an independent nation state from Great Britain. Essentially, they were sovereign. They were separate. They were independent. They were no longer under the rule and control of Great Britain. They walked away. Some other main points, such as there's a conversation that some people would view as being very, very controversial, especially from the time period, because some of the context used in this document. For example, one of the main arguments made is that all people are created equal. Natural rights of life, liberty, and property, per Enlightenment philosopher John Locke. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And one of the issues with this is that enslaved people still were excluded from this all created equal. Women were excluded. At the very, very, very beginning, white non-landowning men also were excluded from this conversation. So it was a very, very select few elitist individuals who actually benefited from this claim of all men are created equal. So all people are created equal. This was something that was very controversial at the time and laid the foundation for some changes to occur, some less formally, others extremely formally, such as the the amending of the Constitution that happens later on in relation to ensuring that the rights of certain groups of people are protected under this umbrella of all people are created equal. Some other ideas and concepts that extended from this idea of the consent of the governed, this idea of limited government, and the social contract theory. These are things that we talked about in class. This idea of the social contract theory states that everyone has a stake in the claim and everyone has the ability to benefit from it. Therefore, by everyone giving and taking from the unified group, it's for the benefit of all. So essentially, going back to primitive times with the creation of villages, people would say, why would an independent nation, or why would an independent entity or a person within a village, why would they want to relinquish some of their rights, relinquish some of their responsibilities, some of their freedoms to this new unified governmental state? And most people say, why would they do that? And essentially the idea is that most people understand that this is a give and take. Essentially, you may give your freedom, but you may have order. You may give up your freedom, you may have organization, you may have protection, you may have access to other resources that if you're just independent amongst yourself, you may not have access to. So there's a lot of different pluses and minuses to the rationale behind the social contract theory, but at its most foundational principles, it's this idea of the collective and how the collective can benefit. So it's essentially what we'll be looking at with that. Essentially the idea that the purpose of government isn't just to govern, but to ensure that the rights of these people are being enforced and protected. So essentially at its foundation, the idea of government's job and responsibility at its core is to ensure that the rights of the people are being held intact, not to infringe upon these rights. And if it does not protect these rights, then the people have the duty to change it. This was another big concept that was covered within the Declaration of Independence, whereas if a group of people within a nation state feel that their government is no longer working in the best interest of the people, then it's the responsibility of the people to remove it and reestablish a new form of government that actually acts in the best interest of the people. So that's kind of the rationale that was being drafted in the Declaration of Independence, and also the justifications as to why the colonists felt that they needed to break away. So, and another big thing to focus on specifically is that they weren't just copying out. They wasn't just saying that they were afraid of hard work. They were afraid of jumping through hurdles or any type of hiccups or issues. This was not the rationale. This was not the attitudes that was being portrayed by the colonists. They instead were not saying that just because something's imperfect that it has to be destroyed, that we have to fix it. It has to take on the form of a phoenix, of being totally destroyed and reborn again. It's not necessarily what they're saying. However, they did say that if the governments were not just imperfect, but if they were tyrannical, if they were focusing just on the interests of themselves, at the despair and at the not just the despair, but at the expense and potentially putting the people in harm's way, then it is the duty of the people to remove this government if they have been infringing upon the natural rights of the people. That's kind of the rationale behind the Declaration of Independence. Everyone knows it was drafted on July 4th, 1776. We celebrate it every single year with the 4th of July. It was drafted in Independence Hall and was voted on Independence Hall in Philadelphia. And initially it was started out across the way at a smaller group, and then eventually it moved over to the Pennsylvania State House, which now has become Independence Hall. So that's essentially what's going on there. Also, during the context, it's a little bit more for you to take and potentially pull from. So most people think that, okay, the Declaration of Independence was drafted in 1776, therefore we must have started the war, American Revolution, right afterwards. Well, actually, the war is actually already occurring. So actually about 14 months prior to the drafting of the Declaration of Independence, we essentially started the American Revolution. In April of 1775, there was a group of militiamen who were in Massachusetts, specifically in Lexington and Concord, and they got into a scuffle with some British troops, and one of the militiamen took and fired upon the British troops, and this has most notoriously been known as the shot that was heard around the world because it initially started the war with Great Britain. So that's something we're going to be looking at. We're now going to start shifting over to the Articles of Confederation. So the Articles of Confederation was the first constitution of the United States. So essentially what happened is that we needed to take and have some form of governmental organization in place that we then could take and be unified under. So there's a lot of intentions behind it. So the colonists were very, very hesitant when it came to creating this nation. You know, this idea that we just broke away from a tyrannical monarch who was not focusing on the interests of the people. And essentially this idea that if you give too much power to a group or to an entity, that essentially it can take and abuse such powers, and that's something they didn't want to focus on. So essentially going back to when I talked about last semester with the invisibility cloak, whereas if you had access to an invisibility cloak and you were able to cover yourself up with it and become invisible and no one could see what you were doing, that you inherently would be off and running. This goes back to ancient philosophies, this rationale. So essentially this idea that if a government's given access to unlimited power, that essentially it would eventually abuse such power and seek out greater power at the expense of the people. So this is something they wanted to prevent from the get-go. So instead of establishing a strong, organized, very top-down, top-heavy federal government system, they instead wanted to create a very weak national government and essentially still delegating more power to the states, allowing the states to be more sovereign. And as we're going to see, there's some pluses and minuses to this in this decade or so of this document. Okay, so the Daughters of Confederation were primarily drafted by John Dickinson, and they were eventually authorized by the Second Continental Congress of the United States. Essentially, some main takeaways from this document was that it was a confederation of states. So it was a collective of states. So states coming together with one unified purpose. However, unlike most unified nations under a federal umbrella, this system delegated more rights and power and freedom to the states and actually limited the powers given to the central government. A lot of limitations were placed on the federal government in this system. So, as we soon would find out, that the limited access and power and influence that the central government had actually eventually led to it being extremely ineffective. Because if you squeeze out and you limit and you limit and you limit and you restrict a government so much that it's so small, so small of influence, eventually its ability to act and to be productive and to show progress becomes non-existent. And that's exactly what we saw here in this system. So one of the big issues is that it could take and it could conversate with other foreign entities, and it could take and try to declare war. However, if this country wanted to declare war, it had to go to each individual state and ask those states if they're willing, one, to go to war, and two, if they're willing to provide the resources, and three, are they willing to fund it? So this is a big issue, and because each nation had the ability to make its own decisions whether or not it wanted to, one, go to war, two, send its people to die for this new country, and three, whether or not it actually wanted to pay for the expenses of this war. And for the most part, this didn't work out too well because the federal government would go to these smaller states and the states would say, one, why am I going to go fight for you? Who are you? Two, why am I going to send my people to die for your new country? Your country could be, this government could be gone tomorrow. You have no influence on me. You have no power. And three, why should I have to pay for your transgressions? Why should I have to pay for your actions? That's your problem, not mine. So this was a sentiment that was very difficult to break during this time period. Another big issue that we had was in relations to currency. We talked about this a lot last semester, whereas each state was able to maintain its own currency. This led to a lot of issues because if someone decided to migrate from state to state or move or travel from state to state, they had to exchange their money in the same way that would happen like in Europe. Whereas you went from one state to another state, you had to take your money, transfer it into that state's money based off of whatever that state's exchange rates were, and they may or may not meet you one-to-one. In some cases, they may devalue your currency. That's not good. So imagine having $100 and you go from, say, Georgia to South Carolina, and now your $100 in Georgia money has only become $60 in South Carolinian money. And then you go from South Carolina, and now you're $60 in South Carolina money. Now you go to North Carolina, and that only becomes $40 in North Carolina money. So before you know it, you could make your way all the way up to, say, Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York, and you may find yourself only having a fraction of the money that you started with. And some people say, well, okay, that's fine. Well, maybe I'll just keep my money, and then as I go travel back down, my money eventually will increase back until I get back to Georgia, and it's good. Not necessarily. Maybe you have New York money. You take your New York money down to Georgia, even though you're a resident of Georgia, they may not give you back your $100 for whatever you had. They may take and say, well, you know what, we don't like New York money. We don't think it's valued at the same rate, therefore we're going to take and we're only going to give you $50 back for your 100. So that's some of the issues that were happening this time period. Also, the question of equality in relations to, okay, so even if we do decide to send our troops, even if we do decide to go to war, and we do decide to fund this war, who's to say that my $5,000 and Massachusetts' $5,000 are actually equal? Maybe in my eyes, my $5,000 would be equivalent to $15,000 in Massachusetts currency. That's another big issue. This is something that needs to be fixed. So that was one of the issues within that state. Also looking at the legislative structure, so how this governing body tried to govern. So you have a one-chamber legislature, and essentially each state within this legislature received one vote. So you would have South Carolina would have one vote, Virginia would have one vote, Massachusetts would have one vote, New York would have one vote, Philadelphia would have one vote, Maryland would have one vote, and you had to have a unanimous vote to be able to take and change this Constitution. So amendments never were passed because you had to have a unanimous vote. That wasn't going to happen. Also, a big issue was this federal government could not tax. That was a big issue. You know, if you can't tax, you can't generate revenue. If a government can't generate revenue, it can't function effectively. That's a big issue. There was no executive branch, so there was no unified leader. There was a lot of reasonings and justifications behind this. One of the biggest idea goes back to the invisibility cloak, that if we render power to one individual, that eventually they're going to take and not be willing to relinquish such power when time comes to do so. And eventually this could lead to a tyrannical government. So that was some of the rationale behind that. There also was no court system at this time period. Each state maintained its own courts, and there's a lot of pluses and minuses to this idea, as well as there was no standing army. So anytime something happened, you had to go to each individual state asking for a army to be drafted up. And this could take a long period of time. This was not very effective, and you could find yourself losing a battle very quickly because of the system. Okay, so from this point in time, we realized very, very quickly that the system was not going to work. It was not going to work. Okay, so this initially, the Articles of Confederation were first introduced in November 15th of 1777, and they were eventually ratified almost 4 years later on March 1st, 1781. So about 4 years it took to draft this document. And one of the big things is that it was being drafted under urgency because we were in the middle of the American Revolution. Remember, it ran from 1775 to 1783. So this is smack dab in the middle of the American Revolution. So it being put in place was very, very important. Okay, so most people make the argument that this system of government served mainly just as a bridge between the initial government of the United States and the Continental Congress. Essentially, this just filled the gap. It was a placeholder until 1787, where we took and decided to change everything. So 1787, you have the delegates to the Constitutional Convention convened in the summer of 1787 to look at these Articles of Confederation. The goal was to take and look through these articles and try to see if they could fix these gaps and these issues within this document. What ended up happening was they realized very, very quickly that there was too many weaknesses within the Articles of Confederation, and that essentially all it did was it was the blueprint, it was the encyclopedia, it was the how-to guide to create a limited government. And in most cases, it was extremely successful at limiting the powers of government, but it also limited the possibility for prosperity and growth of the colonies as well. So you had individuals such as James Madison, who comes forward and decides that something needs to change. So there's a whole bunch of plans that are being enacted during this time period. They realized very, very quickly that they couldn't fix the Articles of Confederation, but they could change it. So you had a couple different plans that came forth during this time period. Most famously was the one that was drafted and created by James Madison. This one was referred to as the Virginia Plan, and a lot of its contents found its way into the United States Constitution, which is why most people take and actually credit James Madison as being the father of the Constitution. So some of the main takeaways, the main ideas, the main points of this new Constitution was that it took and focused a lot on this idea of the social contract theory with new federal government structures, powers, and limitations. So since this idea that popular sovereignty was still intact, that the power still lies in the hands of the people, that people take, and no matter what happens, no matter who's in control, we are still have the final say, that we create the governments and that we can take them away in the same instance. So that's a big difference from the Articles. This also gave rise to this notion of republicanism, which was this idea of electing representatives to act in the stead of the people. So this idea that not all people of a nation can be available at a moment's notice to take and to vote on every issue that's being brought upon. Therefore, because not every person can be somewhere constantly, this idea that we will take and vote in officials to vote in the best interest of the people of a particular region. There's still this notion of limited government. So even though there has been a little bit more power given to the federal government under this document, there's still a lot of limitations on what the government can do and the process about how it does it. It's not just what it can do, but how it does it. So the process that it goes through is very, very strategic to try to limit its ability to act too hastily or to extend itself too much beyond what we feel is worthy of the cause at the time period. Also, what happened during this time period is a complete revamping of the structure of the government. So essentially, the federal government, instead of being one unified legislative body, we instead now have three branches. You have the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. And within these branches, have three different entities with three different prospective responsibilities, roles, and powers, as well as limitations. And this is all drafted in the first three articles of the Constitution. Article 1 focuses on the legislative branch. This one lays the foundation of the structure of rules and laws and how laws are drafted and enacted within this government. The job of the legislative branch is to take and create the laws. We went from having a unicameral one chamber Congress to now having a bicameral two chamber Congress. Even though we acted like we hated Great Britain and we hated the parliamentary system, we copied it greatly in our legislative structure. Whereas in the parliament system in Great Britain, they have a two chamber bicameral Congress, whereas they have the House of Commons and the House of Lords, upper chamber, lower chamber. We have the exact same thing here, whereas we take and we have the House of Representatives in the lower chamber closer to the people, and the United States Senate in the upper chamber, which is viewed as being more powerful, more noteworthy, essentially, this idea. We also took and copied some of their system in a parliamentary system, how to come up with their prime minister, who is their president. That's voted on from members of the parliament. So the people vote in parliament, and the parliament itself votes in their prime minister. We do things a little bit different in our system, whereas instead of doing that with the president, we do that with our Speaker of the House. So the Speaker of the House of Representatives is voted on by the members of the House of Representatives. So we vote in the House of Representatives, and then they vote for who their Speaker is going to be. So we don't do it with our executive branch of our nation, but we do that with our legislative body. Now we're going to shift over to the executive branch. This idea that after some time, after this little bit of a failed honeymoon period of a limited government, non-executive, standing government, we realized really quickly that we need to have somebody in place to look to, not just for guidance, but also for blame, as it's unfortunately become more known in recent years. So essentially with this idea of executive branches, their job is to oversee. They're the chief executive. They carry with that role a lot of different powers and responsibilities. So the idea is that they're supposed to be there as an executive is with a company and oversee the day-to-day operations of the country, ensure that things are actually taking place and the movement of the nation is actually going in the best interest of the people as a whole. And this individual is also voted in by the electorate. And we'll look a little bit further into that in the future. But we focused on that last semester where we looked at how we take and the president's voted in, the popular vote and the electoral college vote. Another controversial sector of American politics. But that's for another time and another day. But okay, so that was the powers, responsibilities, and limitations of the executive branch are outlined in Article 2 of the Constitution. We now shift over to Article 3, which is the judicial branch. And within this branch, you have the court systems. You have the district courts, you have the Court of Appeals, you have the Federal Court of Appeals, and eventually you find yourself all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, which is the highest court of the land. And their job is to look at the constitutionality of actions that have been brought down either by state governments, state legislatures, or state executives, or the executive branch or the legislative branch of the United States government. So their job is to look at whether or not actions done by other governmental bodies within the nation are in fact either justified or are they infringement upon the rights of the people as outlined in this Constitution. So they have a very important role. Now, as we're going to look at when we get to the Supreme Court cases again, they really didn't know what they were supposed to be doing for about almost the first 20 years of their existence. It wasn't until 1803 that they had their first major Supreme Court decision, which gave them the powers that we view now, which is judicial review. That was Marbury versus Madison, 1803. And that changed the entire course and scope of the Supreme Court. But that we're going to look at later this week. Another important thing is that these three branches create an iron triangle. This is something we'll look a little more in depth and at another time. But what we have is equal power and equal ability to check the actions of the other branches. So we're a little bit more in depth than that because you may need to refer to that in your FRQs, but that's another time. We also still have this idea of federalism. Remember, we looked at layer cake versus marble cake federalism, different types of cakes. You have clear distinctions between the rights and the powers of the entities within the system, or it kind of blends together like a marble cake. But what we have is we have sharing of power, the power that's shared between the federal government or the central government and the power of the states. So certain power is given to the states, such as the organization and development and adoption of schools. We have certain power that's given to the federal government, such as like in this new system, you have only one unified form of currency. So you have the federal government who takes and creates our currency, unlike in the Articles of Confederation, where you have each state controlling its currency. This allows for uniformity and allows for there not to be any devaluation of the value of currency from state to state. And also this allows for uniformity. Okay, so another key takeaways is that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Everything that anything that's brought into question about organization, structure, responsibilities, limitations in relation to the federal government or state government powers is outlined in the United States Constitution. So any governmental entity looking to see what it can and can't do, or a member of the general public who's looking to see whether or not they feel that the actions of one of these entities has infringed upon or has exceeded or has exploited one of these potential powers would refer to this supreme law of the land known as the United States Constitution. Within this series, we also have a lot of compromises within the Constitution. So there was a lot of compromises that happened. Most famously, you had the 3/5 compromise. This one is in relation to representation and the legislative body. So what happens is that you take and in our structure of the legislative branch, you have the lower chamber of the House of Representatives, whereas representation is based off of population. So what the House does is it votes on a particular number of representatives, and that number is then broken up by all of the states within the Union. As of right now, we have 50, and the total amount of representatives in the House currently is 435. It's been that way for about 70 years, but it always could take and change. All they have to do is propose a new amendment to change that. So what happens is every 10 years, we have the United States Census. What the census does is it tracks what people move to. People are born, people die, people move. It takes and keeps track of all of the data. So what happens is that we look at the numbers and we see, does the population change in one region of the country in relation to another region of the country? If so, this is going to impact that state's representation. So right now in 2020, we have a census currently going on. They're tracking the populations of states. What they're going to do is a thing called reapportionment. whereas they're going to look and see, did populations increase or decrease in certain regions? Did those increases or decreases exceed into a certain parameter that takes and allows for the shifting of representatives from state to state? We talked about this before. Say, for example, if Georgia lost 1 million people to Florida, Georgia would lose a representative in the House and Florida would gain one. So this idea of this happening. So what was going on is that majority of the northern states had a very large population of freed people. In contrast to that, the southern states had a very large enslaved population. And the argument that there was a big discrepancy between the numbers of freed people in the South and the total number of people in the South. And the argument made by a lot of the Southerners was that they felt that they were being discriminated against, and this new policy was infringing on their rights because they weren't able to actually count every warm body in their state. So what occurred was they took and eventually they came up with the Three-Fifths Compromise, which allowed for a certain number of slaves to count as a certain number of freed people in relations to representation for the southern states as a form of equity, I guess you could say. There's a lot of other compromises that occurred in this time period as well, but that was one of them. You also had the Mississippi Compromise that happened in the 1850s, 1860s, whereas you took and each time a new state joined the Union, if it was a freed state, the next state had to be an enslaved state, or vice versa. So there was this idea of 1-to-1. So a state, if the previous state was a freed state, this new state that joined the Union would have to be an enslaved state, or would have to have the option to be an enslaved state if it would like to be. So that was one of the compromises that we focused on under the Constitution that stemmed from this basic foundation and drafting in 1787 in the hot summer of Philadelphia. Okay, also under the system was the amendment process. This is covered in Article 5. And what happens here is that they can take and we can change it. Okay, the U.S. Constitution is a living, breathing document that if we feel that something is outdated or needs to be changed, or we feel that something that was viewed as being okay in the past, but now is viewed as being an infringing entity, we can take and go in and change it. So that's something that's very important. It's also something that we hold very dear, seeing that even though this document's been around for 240-ish years, we've only changed it 27 times. So that definitely shows the remarkable standing in the staying power and the holding power of this document. As well as within the system, we have a system of the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. As soon as this Constitution was enacted and as soon as it was ratified, a lot of states refused to ratify it unless it had this Bill of Rights in place. One of the arguments made was that they needed to ensure that the rights of the people were in fact protected. They couldn't just look at implying it. They couldn't just assume it. They wanted to see it black and white, clear as crystal. That's what they wanted to see. So there's a compromise. As soon as the Constitution was ratified, there was initially a proposition put in place to amend this new Constitution. And this new amendment of the Constitution added 10 amendments. These have been known as the Bill of Rights. These outlines the inalienable rights of the people of the nation. And these are referred to a lot. And they're referred to a lot on the exam. And we refer to them a lot in relations to the Supreme Court cases, because for the most part, almost every Supreme Court case that we're going to be looking at focuses on either one of the 10 amendments or focuses on a few of the Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments. So that's typically what we're looking at. So that's pretty much it for the first three documents. We're going to be focusing on, in our next lesson, I'm going to show you the pre-course. So we're going to be looking at the Federalist Papers as well as Brutus. These were the documents that were either in favor or in opposition to the drafting of the Constitution. So these are very important that we take a look at, because they kind of led as the precursor as to what eventually became of the Constitution, what led to the voting on the drafting of the Bill of Rights, and how this all kind of looked in the beginning of the country and how it's impacted our country today. So that's pretty much it for today. When we come back, we're going to be looking at Fed 10, Fed 51, as well as Brutus 1. And depending on, we may cover Fed 70 and the next lesson, or I may get moved on to the third video. As always, see you next time.